It is one of the most famous battles in British history, remembered as the largest number of Victoria Crosses won in a single action, and its name and deeds used at the time to cover up the disastrous defeat that had happened only hours earlier, and is now largely remembered due to a film telling, albeit slightly fictionalised version of events. But how many are aware that among the 140 men who stood against a large force of over 3,000 was a man from Norfolk, whose life had taken him from a quiet countryside village to the sun-baked plains of South Africa and the hastily built defences of Rorke's Drift. But he was no soldier, rather a civilian missionary who would play a pivotal role as the battle raged around him. George Smith was born on the 8th of January 1845 in the North Norfolk village of Docking to William and Frances Smith, and he would be their youngest of 3 sons. His younger life is somewhat unknown. It is possible that he started out aiding his father of his shoemaking business, where he employed 2 local men, so it seems like the kind of place where family help would be greatly appreciated. George would leave the family home in his mid-teenage years, moving to the nearby town of King's Lynn, where he took lodging rooms and found a job working as a railway clerk by the age of 16. But George wasn't going to have a life of timetables and ticket prices ahead of him in a busy North Norfolk town. 2 major factors would lead him down a path that would change his life forever. One of them would be his clearly strong religious convictions, and the other would be the large growing force of the British Empire as it spread out across the world, and specifically in his case to the vast and largely unexplored by Europeans continent of Africa. As the eyes of nearly all the major European nations turned to Africa, so did the eyes of their respected churches, wishing to convert tribes to their faith. And it would be here where George Smith would come into the story again. After finishing religious studies at college in Canterbury, he became a missionary and sailed for what is today South Africa in 1870, as a lay missionary working for a society for the proclamation of the gospel. I have found virtually nothing about his years spent as a missionary, but by all accounts he was a very hard-working man. Driven by his passion, he was, in 1872, ordained as a priest by the Anglican Bishop of Natal, John William Colenso, although it must also be remembered that he was indeed a man of his time, seeing his work in Africa as his God-given duty to convert local tribes from what he saw as heathen ways and bring them to the light. But while he applied his work, the business of politicians and kings around him looked to tear the very fabric of the nations apart. Relationships between the British authorities, Boer settlers, and native Zulus and other tribes had been cordial at best and often uneasy. But by the 1870s, they were practically in nosedive, pushed to the brink by large-scale annexations of huge swaths of land by Britain, after the discovery of diamonds in several locations in the late 1860s. Attempts were made to create a federation, as had worked in Canada, with the British even bringing in the same man who had achieved that, Henry Howard Molyneux Herbert, in 1874. But the Boers refused to agree, fearing that British influence would mean an end to their long-wanted republic. But just 3 years later, after the growing threat from the Zulu, the British annexed the Transvaal on the grounds of security anyway. While these factions in Africa argued and postured, the prospect of war was not something that pleased the British government back home, with Prime Minister Disraeli making it very clear in a letter to the Secretary of State for the Colonies that as far as he saw it, Eastern Europe and the Indies were of much more importance than fighting in the Cape of Africa. But regardless of what he might have wanted, war was on the way. The current Zulu king, Cachuayo, did not rule over a very happy kingdom. Yes, it is true that they had gone from a small, largely unknown tribe to a kingdom of over 11,500 square miles, under the command of their famous king Shaka, Cachuayo's half-uncle. But this was long ago, and Shaka was now long dead, and it must have seemed that along with him went the old glories they had once enjoyed. In Cachuayo's own lifetime, he had seen the astonishing defeat at the hands of Boer settlers at the Battle of Blood River, that for 3 wounded had seen 3,000 Zulus killed. And now, not only did he find his borders lined with European soldiers, but his lands were infiltrated by diamond hunters, settlers, explorers, and of course, missionaries. He set out to rebuild what his half-uncle had done, and make the Zulu a force to be reckoned with again. Still using the old ways put forward by Shaka, the Zulus were trained from a very young age to be warriors, both with their traditional weapons and now, as you will see, bringing in more modern firearms at times as well. The fuse to the powder keg that was the current state of South Africa had been lit. Things would come to a head in the summer and autumn of 1878. 3 incidents occurred that would lead to all-out war. The first 2 were involving 2 escaped wives of a Zulu chief, who had fled from Zululand into the Natal province that was under British control, where they thought they would be safe. But this was not to be, and on 2 separate dates a week apart, a group of Zulu warriors, including the chief's brother and son, crossed the border and took these women back to Zululand, where they were executed. The third involved a Mr. Smith, not our one, a surveyor in the Colonial Engineering Department, who was near the Zulu border but had not crossed it, when he was suddenly surrounded by about 20 warriors and taken prisoner. He was threatened with death, and had a higher-ranking village elder not intervened and made sure he was let go, who knows what might have happened. Alone, these incidents seem a rather petty reason to go to war, but they were the last in a long line of provocations from all sides. And there also being a great push from the British authorities in South Africa that if they didn't start a war on the Zulus soon, the Zulu would start war on them. But also, please remember, this is not an in-depth video on the Zulu War itself. This is merely some slight background information to set the picture. And also in this case, I would like to point out that 2 battles coming up described will not be talked about in great detail, other than the actions of Smith himself. After several letters back and forth between the involved parties, the British drew up an ultimatum to Cachuweya on the 1st of December 1878, giving him until the 10th of January the next year to respond to avoid war. Among the demands, such as the arrest and trial in a Natal court of the warriors who had taken part in the murders, and that all missionaries and British agents who had been expelled from Zululand 2 years earlier, among them most likely George Smith, were allowed to return and carry on their work. There was also demands that the Zulu army be disbanded and reformed under direction from British representatives. The ultimatum was far from a hollow threat. An army of 18,000 men were assembled at the Cape, made up of regular British troops, colonial volunteers, and Natal African auxiliaries, led by Lord Chelmsford. Cachuweya knew he could not agree to these terms, but nor did he want to be seen as the aggressor in this war. He gave orders that all fighting should remain within Zululand, and forbade his troops from crossing the river into Natal, something that will be important later, and initially wanted his men to ignore irregular troops where possible, and attack only regular British soldiers. When no answer for the ultimatum came, an invasion force of 4,700 men set out. Riding with them was George Smith, eager to return to his missionary work among the Zulu. In the meantime, he had got himself appointed as an assistant army chaplain, a role that, although attached him to the army, still had him as a civilian. He travelled with the ill-fated Central Column, and as he rode along, George must have been an impressive sight, as he would have been anywhere. As for the time, he was a giant of a man, 6'6" tall and weighing about 18 stone, while the average height of a man at this time was 5'6". He also sported a long flowing red beard down to his chest, and he would have been certainly unmissable. This would also not be the first time he had been part of a military unit. He had ridden with the Weenan Yeomanry, a short-lived local volunteer unit in 1873, during an uprising by a Bantu chief. Many of the men who had joined it were from his parish, so he felt it was only right to go with them, saying, "Should the worst come to the worst, I feel that my duty is to be in attendance upon their spiritual requirements." The uprising had been crushed easy enough by local volunteers, so Smith, along with many others, must have been highly confident that a force of regular troops could sweep aside the Zulu without too much trouble. As they reached the border with Zululand, the Central Column stopped at a small mission station known as Rorke's Drift, where they left their sick, some wounded, and some of their supplies, along with a small garrison to guard them before pushing on. Among those staying was Smith. Maybe he felt his skills were best served looking after those in need for the time being, or maybe he felt in hindsight it might have been a bit too early to be returning with the Zulu threat still around. But for whatever reason he had chosen to delay his travel slightly and stay at the drift would save his life. As the rest of the column marched off and split, many of them, and also most likely where Smith would have been, made camp at a place known as Isandlwana, a place that most of them would never leave. After some time at the drift, Smith was preparing to move forward and join the main force, when news arrived that sent the whole encampment into panic, as recorded in Smith's diary. At about 3 o'clock p.m., or shortly after, several mounted men arrived from Isandlwana and reported the terrible disaster which had occurred. A disaster was to put it lightly. The column, numbering around 1,300 men, had met a force of around 20,000 Zulu, and had been wiped out almost to a man, with as few as 50 European survivors and a couple of hundred African natives being able to get away. The exact events of what happened that day are still partially unknown, given how few survivors were left on the European side to tell of it, and in many cases no survivors of incidents at all, and the Zulus had no written records of the event until years later. But one Zulu warrior, interviewed after the war, described the stand of the regular forces as such. "Ah, those red soldiers at Isandlwana, how few they were, and how they fought. They fell like stones, each man in his place." But now, for the small force at Rorke's Drift, a far bigger problem came. By all accounts, the Zulu were heading their way. Fortunately, not the 20,000, but rather 4,000 warriors who had made up the reserve at Isandlwana and not taken part in the fighting. But nor did they want to miss their chance of fame and glory fighting the British. And they were now prepared to ignore their own king's orders to achieve this, as Rorke's Drift lay across the river and out of Zululand itself. And all that now stood before them was about 140 men, mostly of B Company, 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment of Foot. And, just a slight note here, those who have seen Zulu will probably expected me to have called them the South Wales Borderers, but this for the time would be untrue. Their name would not become the South Wales Borderers until 1881 under the Childs Reforms. Smith writes of the preparations for battle. Lieutenant Bromhead, commander of B Company of the 2nd Battalion, 24th Regiment, at once struck his camp and sent down for Lieutenant Chard, Royal Engineers, who was engaged with some half a dozen men at Ponce on the river, to come up and direct the preparations for defence. As in the absence of Major Spaulding, the command of the post devolved onto him. The windows and doors of the hospital were blocked up with mattresses, etc., and loopholes were made for the wall, both in the hospital and the storehouse. A wall of mealies and other grain bags was made, enclosing the front of the hospital and running along the edge of the rocky terrace to the stone wall of the corral. As the soldiers prepared, Smith and 2 others went forward to act as lookouts, climbing a nearby hill. Their hopes were raised when they saw a blessed sight. Reinforcements. Men of the Natal native contingent, who, although originally coming from tribes like the Zulu, now fought for Britain, and it seemed as if there was a lot of them. But as these miraculous saviours drew closer, the full horror dawned on Smith and his compatriots. These were not their allies. This was in fact the Zulu force, heading straight for them. The 3 men took off in a sprint for their lives back to the relative safety of the drift. And relative was certainly the key word here. All involved must have known they were in for a hard fight. Did they have enough ammunition? Would their defences hold, or would the warriors simply sweep over them in a great wave of stabbing spears? And they didn't just have to worry about the Zulu in hand-to-hand fighting either, although many still fought with their traditional weapons. There was a smattering of firearms among the attackers, mostly older muzzle-loading rifles, but here and there were more up-to-date weapons acquired from traders and by other means over the years. At 4:30 p.m, the Zulus came into sight, around the right-hand end of a large hill in our rear. Only about 20 at first appeared, advancing in the open. Their numbers were speedily augmented, and their line extended quite across the neck of land from hill to hill. A great number of dongas in their advance, a stream with steep banks, and the garden, with all its trees and surroundings, gave them great facility for getting near to us unseen. The garden must have been occupied, for one unfortunate contingent corporal, whose heart must have failed him when he saw the enemy and heard the firing, got over the parapet and tried to make an escape on foot, but a bullet from the garden struck him, and he fell dead within 150 yards of our front wall. In moments, the air around the mission exploded into the fury of fighting, of charge of Zulu and crack of Martini rifle. During the battle for the tiny mission station, Smith, being a civilian and a missionary, was naturally a non-combatant, and therefore was not expected to take up a rifle and join the men on the hastily made barricades. Instead, he took it upon himself, along with others, to make sure the one thing keeping the Zulus at bay, the Martini Henry rifles, didn't run dry. At great risk to himself, he went along the battle line, handing out ammunition to the desperate men, all while reciting Bible passages at the top of his voice. He also was a great help to many wounded, with it being said as soon as a man fell, Smith was next to him, either helping him back to the surgeon or doing all he could in the man's final moments. Despite the chaos unfolding around him, Smith was still very much a man of God and expected others to hold themselves to a certain standard around him. In the middle of one attack, he came upon a group of soldiers using language that he found distasteful and berated them. "Don't swear, men, don't swear, but shoot them, boys, shoot them." It would also seem that from Smith's diary, the fairly accurate rifle fire was not going in just one direction. The Zulus who were armed with rifles providing harassing fire to the men in the drift were playing a good deal of havoc with the defenders. Clearly the rifles were given to warriors who had proved themselves to be the best shots. A whisper passed amongst the men. "Poor old King Cole is killed." He was at the front wall. A bullet passed through his head and struck the next man upon the bridge of the nose, but the latter was not seriously hurt. King Cole must have been the nickname of Private Thomas Cole of B Company, and he would be far from the only one to fall victim to the Zulus' sharpshooting. Presently, Corporal C. Samuel, Natal native contingent, who was near Mr. Byrne, was shot through the shoulder and the back. He crawled a short distance and handed the remainder of his cartridges to Lieutenant Chard, then expressed a desire for a drink of water. Byrne at once fetched it, but whilst giving it to him, was shot through the head and fell dead instantly. Despite the casualties rising around him, and I'm sure at times Smith wishing he probably was a slightly less distinctive-looking fellow, he would carry on with his duty throughout the whole battle. As the sun went down and the night came in, the battle still raged at times, although fighting had died down for a while, and into the early hours of the next morning. After 12 hours of fighting that saw much of Rorke's Drift destroyed by fire, the Zulus retreated, having taken large losses, with as many as 500 Zulu killed compared to 17 defenders. At last daylight dawned, and the enemy retired around the shoulder of the hill which they had approached. While some remained at their posts, others of our men went out to patrol and returned with about 100 rifles and guns, and some 400 assegais left by the enemy on the field and around our walls, and especially in front of the hospital, where dead Zulu lay piled up in heaps. About 350 were subsequently buried by us. They must have carried off nearly all of their wounded with them. Unlike Isandlwana, Rorke's Drift had been a British victory, but it had been a close-run battle, and the defenders probably could not have stood up to another full-on attack. Before the battle, the ammunition stores at Rorke's Drift totalled 20,000 rounds. By the time the Zulu pulled out, it was down to just 900. You can find a link in the description below to extracts from his diary of that day. And one thing you will notice that I think says a lot about the kind of person he was. Smith seems to heap praise on everyone, from the officers to the regular soldiers, mentioning several of the future Victoria Cross winners by name, but not once does he seem to mention any of his own deeds that day. His actions during the fighting at the Drift earned him the name Ammunition Smith, and huge praise from all involved, being mentioned in several official reports of the battle sent back to Britain. And any time he was seen by a man who fought at Rorke's Drift, they were said to have cheered his name as he walked by. But due to being a civilian, he was not entitled to any medals for his actions, including the Victoria Cross. That, although had been awarded to civilians in the past during the Indian Mutiny, rules had since been clarified and it was now a purely military honour. And it's highly likely he would have been awarded one, as men who carried out similar and identical duties to him was awarded one. But he was offered to become a full army chaplain. Effectively being offered a job for life and a military pension, he took the opportunity. He followed the rest of the campaign through the Zulu kingdom, even presiding over the burials of Neville Coghill and Tinmouth Melville, the 2 lieutenants from the 24th killed in the final moments of Isandlwana, saving the regimental colours from falling into enemy hands, which would see them both awarded the Victoria Cross. He was present at the capture of the Zulu capital of Ulundi, and the picture shown on screen now is believed to be Smith, taken near the site where Louis Napoleon was killed fighting with the Zulu in June of 1879. After the end of the Zulu War, Padre Smith carried on attached to the army, returning to England in 1880, where he was chaplain at Aldershot until 1881, when he was then sent to Cork in Ireland, before joining the Wolseley expedition into Egypt in September 1882. That found him in the middle of the Anglo-Egyptian War, at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir, a battle which we will cover in more detail in future, as by coincidence the lone Victoria Cross won that day was by another Norfolk man, leading a charge against Egyptian artillery. He also found himself as part of the expedition into the Sudan in 1884, in the vain attempt to end the siege of Khartoum and save the national hero General Charles George Gordon, being involved in the Battle of Guinis, noted in history as the last time the famous red coats of the British Army were used on a large scale, as khaki uniforms were now beginning to fully take over. Away from the affairs of the Empire, George Smith also found himself stationed in many locations back in Britain, dealing with the spiritual needs of his troops. In 1891, he was working at the Royal Victoria Hospital near Southampton, while living in the village of Hound. And on the 10th of February 1900, he was promoted to Chaplain of the Forces First Class, equivalently the rank of Colonel. He retired in 1905, but he wouldn't return to Norfolk, rather staying in the area of his final posting at Fulwood Barracks near Preston, soon settling and calling the area his home. He took up residence in Sumpter's Hotel in Preston, and soon became a well-known figure in the town due to his past exploits, and of course his unmistakable look, especially among the city's religious communities, where he earned another nickname, being widely known in the area as Daddy Smith. Possibly due to him living there, the Sumpter's Hotel at one point erected a picture of the Battle of Rorke's Drift. He was quick to go to it and began writing people's names next to them on the picture so anyone who viewed it would know who was who. He spent his later years travelling, especially during the British winter, visiting America and Panama in 1912, and to New Zealand and Sydney in Australia in 1913, where, although being interviewed by the Sydney Herald newspaper, who proclaimed him a hero, he did not wish to talk about his part in the battle. He lived in Preston until his death on the 26th of November 1918 from bronchitis, aged 73. I have been unable to find his obituary in any paper in Britain, but I've been able to find one for the previously mentioned Sydney Herald. Rorke's Drift hero, Reverend George Smith, passes hence. A worldwide interest will be taken in the death of Reverend George Smith on November 27th in England. This took place at the Sumner's Hotel, Fulworth, where the famous army chaplain had been in residence for some time. Mr. Smith was previously known and admired in church circles in Sydney, as he spent a few days here less than a decade ago on his way to New Zealand where he had friends. On that occasion, he was once recognised by hundreds who had never seen him before in the flesh, and in the same way his death will carry with it the feeling of loss to thousands, who have been impressed by the admirable portrayal of him by the painting of De Neville, the celebrated picture of Rorke's Drift in the new South Wales Art Gallery. Amidst the flames and the smoke of the burning hospital huts, standing behind their frail breastwork of biscuit boxes and mealie bags, stand the devout British soldiers who are resisting the Zulu hordes. No figure among them is more striking than that of the big, bearded Padre, who hands up cartridges from their fast diminishing supply to Major Chard VC and other desperate defenders. This man is George Smith. Mr. Smith was a native of Docking, Norfolk, and he never married. He lost his two elder brothers within a short period of his own death, which was preceded by indifferent health for a few weeks. He was buried in Preston Cemetery with full military honours, the gun carriage bearing his coffin covered by the Union Jack, and being accompanied by military escort and a firing party, while a numerous party of officers from Fulwood Barracks also attended. The fateful Padre was not forgotten by the regiment that immortalised itself in 1879, as the officers of the 24th Regiment placed a wreath upon his coffin, bearing the words, "In memory of Rorke's Drift." As said in his obituary, Smith had never married or had any children, leading to his funeral to being a rather understated affair when he was laid to rest on the 2nd of December, in the New Hall Lane Cemetery in Preston, Lancashire. His grave reads, "To live in the hearts we leave behind is not to die. Sacred to the memory of Reverend George Smith, Chaplain to the Forces, one of the heroes of Rorke's Drift, who died on the 26th of November 1918, aged 73. He was brave and modest, Christian gentleman." During his life, Smith was well remembered and celebrated for his actions at Rorke's Drift, featuring in both the paintings known as the Defence of Rorke's Drift, both depicting him handing out ammunition to the 24th. But as time has gone on, his part has been overlooked, not helped by his absence from the 1964 film Zulu, which is the basis of most people's knowledge of the battle. And although a good film, as said a couple of times before, the removal of Smith is not its only inaccuracy. although a fictionalised version of him does appear in the novel Flashman and the Tiger by George MacDonald Fraser of the famous Flashman novel series. He's also remembered in the Museum of Army Chaplaincy. And for the wargamers and model collectors out there, a figure of him is available for those who wish to build the Battle of Rorke's Drift set. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Please feel free to like and subscribe if you wish. This was Padre George Ammunition Smith, the Norfolk man at Rorke's Drift, and this was a little bit of history.